The fire came out of the northwest on the 14th of October at about 2 in the afternoon. Marit Sohlberg saw it from her own doorway, which was a doorway cut into the side of a hill, because she had not had a house in 3 years. She watched it for perhaps 40 seconds. Then she went and got the mare. There were 11,000 tons of hay stacked between that fire and the town of Nordheim, and every ton of it belonged to somebody who had stopped speaking to her. She knew exactly how long she had. She had watched fire cross that ground before, 40 minutes to the section line, an hour or a little over to the stacks. And there was one thing on this earth that would stop it, and she owned it, and it was a walking plow. Judson Wick met her at the section corner with his horse blown and his hat gone, and he had ridden 4 miles to find her. Can you save the stacks? I can try to. There's nobody else out here who's ever plowed guard against a running fire, and I've got 40 men who don't know how, and no time to teach them, Mr. Wick, said Marit Sohlberg. You are wasting the only thing either of us has got. Go and put your 40 men on the west side of the stacks with wet sacks, and tell them not one of them is to go out into the grass for any reason whatever. I'll do the guard. He went. Here is why she was living in a hole in a hillside on the best quarter of land in that township. On the 9th of June, 1892, a westbound freight went through the Sohlberg place at about 4 in the afternoon in a dry spell, and it threw sparks, and it set the grass along the right-of-way. And the fire took her house and her barn and her granary and her machinery and 11 stacks and burned to the section road before the neighbors turned it. That was not unusual. It happened up and down that line every dry summer for 30 years. Locomotives threw sparks, and the grass along the right-of-way was never mown, and the companies knew it, and the farmers knew it, and mostly what a farmer did about it was rebuild. Marit Sohlberg sued the railroad. She was 41, and she had been widowed in 1889, and she had no children and no relations in that country, and what she had instead was her husband's brother-in-law's cousin in Fargo, who was a lawyer, and who told her that under the statute a railroad company was liable for fire communicated by its engines, and that this was not a difficult case and had been won before. It took 19 months. She went to Fargo 11 times. She was deposed twice and sat in a courtroom for 4 days and was asked, among other things, whether she had been burning trash that afternoon and whether her stove had been drawing and whether she could account for her own whereabouts between 3 and 5 o'clock, and whether it was not the case that a woman farming alone might be careless about a fire. The company's position was not that its engine had not thrown sparks. Its position was that there was no proof this particular engine had thrown these particular sparks, which was true, and which is why the statute existed in the first place. Because that proof is impossible, and the legislature had known it was impossible. Her lawyer put a section foreman on the stand who testified that the right-of-way had not been mown along that stretch in 2 years, and that he had reported it twice, and that was the whole case. She won it. The judgment was for a good deal less than she had lost, and it was still the largest sum ever paid out on a fire claim in that county, and it was reported in the Fargo papers, and there was a paragraph about it in a railroad trade journal in Chicago. And then, in the spring of 1984, the road stopped putting stock cars on the Nordheim siding. Nothing was announced. Nothing was written. The agent said the cars were wanted elsewhere and that he was sure it would come right, and it did not come right, and by that autumn the Nordheim farmers were hauling stock 11 miles to Tolman to ship and paying for the privilege out of their own pockets. Nobody could prove one thing. That is exactly the point, and she understood it perfectly well. There was no order and no letter and no man who had said it. A railroad does not have to punish a county. It simply has to be slightly less convenient to it indefinitely, and let the county work out why. The county worked out why. Nobody was cruel to her. That has to be said, and she said it herself. There was no incident, no words in the street, nothing that could be pointed at. What there was instead was that in the space of about 8 months, she stopped being asked to things, and then stopped being spoken to at the store beyond what was necessary, and then, by the end of 95, found that she could stand in the Nordheim post office on a Saturday morning among 14 people she had known for 11 years and not have one conversation. She counted the third time. That is the thing she was least willing to tell anybody, and she told it once, to Judson Wick, in 1902. She stood at that window and counted how many people said good morning to her, and it was 2, and one of them was the postmaster, who had to. And she went out and got up on the wagon and drove 11 miles home and did the chores, and the following Saturday she went back in, because a person who stops going in has agreed to something. And the terrible part, the part she said she could never explain to anybody who had not lived in a small place, was that they were not wrong. She had been right in law, and they were paying for it. Every one of those men was hauling 11 miles to Tolman because a woman on the north side of the township had gone and won a case. She could do the arithmetic as well as they could. She did it more often than they did. So she did not blame them, and she did not leave. She could not have rebuilt in any case. The judgment had gone on the debts and on her lawyer and on the note that was against the place before the fire ever started. And what was left of it bought a mare and a walking plow and seed, and she dug into the south slope of the hill and put a stovepipe through the roof of it and cropped 160 acres alone for 3 years. What a dugout is, since almost nobody has seen one, a room cut back into a bank with a plank front and one window and a sod roof, and it is dry if the bank is right, and wet if it is not. And hers was right. It was 11 feet by 14. It held a stove, a bed, a table, a chair, a flour barrel, and a shelf of books, and it was warmer in January than the house had been. She was not romantic about it, and she was not ashamed of it. What she said about those 3 years was that a dugout is a perfectly good place to live, and a very poor place to be seen living, and that the second part was the whole of the difficulty. She cropped the 160 alone. She hired at harvest when she could get anybody, and in 95 she could not get anybody. And she cut and shocked 40 acres of wheat herself over 19 days and lost about a third of it to the weather while she was doing it. And she learned fire. That is the thing that mattered on the 14th of October. A woman who has been burned out once and has no house and no insurance and no neighbor who will come does not learn fire as a subject. She learns it as arithmetic every dry autumn for 3 years, because there is nothing between her and it. She plowed guard around her own quarter every September. She learned what a guard has to be, which is not 1 furrow and not 2. It is 2 plowed strips with a width of grass between them, and then you burn the grass in the middle in the morning when the wind is down, so that what the fire arrives at is not a line, but a belt of bare dirt 8 or 9 yards across that has already been burned and has nothing left in it to take. She learned that a guard plowed in a hurry with the wind-up is worth about half of one plowed properly, and that a guard is worth nothing at all if the fire can jump it on a tumbleweed. And she had watched a tumbleweed carry fire 19 yards across bare ground on her own place in 1893 and had put it out with a wet sack and had never forgotten it. None of that is in a book. She got all of it the hard way in 3 seasons, and there was not another person in that township who had it. Now, the 14th of October. She had 1 mare and a 14-inch walking plow, which is a plow a person walks behind holding 2 handles, and it turns 1 furrow at a time. The distance she needed was about 1,100 yards. She did not have time to make a proper belt. She knew that inside the first minute. What she could do, at the pace a good mare walks and a woman half runs behind a plow and stubble, was 4 furrows, 2 strips of 2, and then set fire to the grass between them herself and let it burn out toward the main fire, which is called a backfire, and which is the whole of the trick. Because a fire that has already burned a strip cannot burn it a second time. The wind was out of the northwest at about 15 miles an hour and freshening. She started at this section corner at 2:15. It is very hard to make a walking plow sound like anything. It is not dramatic. It is a woman leaning on 2 wooden handles with the lines round her shoulders, keeping a 14-inch share in the ground at a walk that is faster than a walk, in stubble, on a quarter she does not own any more, with her eyes streaming from smoke that arrived 20 minutes before the fire did. She was 2 hours and 10 minutes doing it. She burned the middle out at 4 o'clock, walking the line with a kerosene torch made out of a sack on a fork handle, lighting it in short runs and beating out what tried to come back at her over the plowed edge, and that is the dangerous part of the whole business, and she has never made much of it either. And at about 5:20, the head of that fire came down onto 1,100 yards of burned belt and stood up and roared and went out along it and turned the way fire turns when it has nothing to eat, and ran off south along the guard into a slough where it died in the wet ground about 9 o'clock that night. The wind swung west at about 4:30, which she had not counted on and which nearly undid the whole thing. Because a guard is only a guard across the line, the fire is coming on, and a fire that comes at it from a new quarter can go round the end of it. She saw it swing. She was at the east end with the torch, and she felt it on the side of her face, and she looked up, and she said afterward that this was the only moment in the entire afternoon when she thought it was not going to work. What she did was leave the last 200 yards unburned and take the mare and the plow east at a trot and put 4 more furrows on the north side of the last stack, which is not a guard and would not have stopped anything, and which was simply the only thing there was time to do. The wind swung back at 5:10. She has always said that she had nothing to do with that part. The stacks did not burn, not one of them. 11,000 tons of hay belonging to 41 men who had not spoken to Marit Sohlberg in 2 years. But here is the thing that happened at about 2:30, while she was on her 4th furrow and could not see any of it, and it is the reason this is a story and not merely a hard afternoon. Judson Wick's 40 men were on the west side of the stacks with wet sacks, exactly where she had told them to be, and from there they had a clear view northwest up the line. And at about 2:30 a second westbound freight came through on the same grade, into the same wind, and threw sparks into the grass in front of 41 men. They put that one out. It was small, and it was close, and they were standing right there, and they beat it out with sacks in about 11 minutes. But they saw it. 41 men watched a locomotive set a prairie fire on the 14th of October in 1896, from about 200 yards in daylight, with nothing whatever to argue about. Nobody said anything at the time. There was a fire coming. But 11 men stood on the west side of those stacks for 2 hours after the guard held, with nothing to do and nothing to look at except a burned belt running away north across the stubble, and a woman a mile off walking a mare up and down the length of it putting out what still smoked. Judson Wick said afterward that not one of them talked about her at all that whole 2 hours, and that he had never in his life heard so many men be so busy not saying a thing. What was said afterward, and what was said over that winter, and what the county eventually did about it, is the actual end of this story, and it did not involve anybody apologizing to Marit Sohlberg, which she said afterward was just as well, because she would not have known what to do with it. What happened was that in February of 9711 Nordheim farmers filed claims against the road for fire damage going back 4 years. And every one of those claims was settled, not tried, settled, quietly and reasonably promptly on a precedent that had been established in that county in 1894 by a woman living in a dugout on the north side of the township, whose case her own neighbors had spent 3 years resenting her for. 2 of the 11 understood that at the time. Judson Wick was one of them. He told her about it in April sitting on the wagon tongue outside the dugout, and she listened to the whole of it and then said that she supposed it was something, and he said it was a good deal more than something. And she said that a thing which happens to help people who would rather it had not come from you is not a comfort exactly. He thought about that for a while and said that he would not argue with her about it, and that she was probably right, and that he had not brought it up to make her feel better. What did you bring it up for? Because it's true, said Judson Wick, and there's not going to be anybody else who says it to you. He came out to her place in March with a wagon and 1,100 board feet of lumber on it and no explanation, and when she came up out of the dugout and stood there looking at it, he said the only thing he ever said about any of it, which was, "You'll not want to winter in a hole again." Marit Sohlberg looked at that lumber for a while. "I'll pay for it. You'll not." "Mr. Wick, it's not mine," said Judson Wick. "It's from 11 men, and I've been asked not to say which, and 2 of them told me they'd sooner I didn't say anything at all, and one of them was fairly rude to me about it, and I'd take it as a kindness if you'd let me get it off this wagon before it rains." She let him get it off the wagon. They put the house up that summer, she and Judson Wick and 2 hired men, and it was a small house and a plain one, and it had 4 rooms and a real floor, and she moved into it in September of 97, 5 years and 3 months after the fire. She kept the dugout. She did not fill it in, and she did not knock the front out of it. And for the next 30 years it held seed potatoes and a cream separator, and in 1936 a family from 2 townships over who had been burned out themselves and had nowhere at all to be for 6 weeks. Her granddaughter asked her once why she had never filled it in, and Marit said that it was a perfectly good room, and that she had not been unhappy in it, and that a person ought not to fill in a thing that kept them dry for 3 years merely because they would rather not think about it. They were not married for another 2 years, and by her own account he made no move whatever in the first of them, and when she finally asked him about that, he said that a man who brings a woman a wagon load of lumber and then comes courting has made the lumber into something else, and he had not been willing to do that to it. She said that was the best reason she had ever heard for anything. They were married in the autumn of '99, and she farmed that quarter for another 31 years, and the house that was built out of Judson Wick's wagon load stood until 1961. The county never did quite come round in the way stories usually have it. Some of them did. About half, she reckoned. The other half were civil to her for the rest of her life and never got past the fact that she had been the one who was right. And she said that this was fair enough and that she had stopped needing anything from them somewhere around 4 o'clock on the 14th of October with a burning sack on a fork handle in her hands. The Nordheim siding got its stock cars back in 1901. And in 1904 the county commissioners passed an ordinance requiring a plowed and burned fireguard on every section line abutting the right-of-way to be maintained at the road's expense, which is what she had been doing alone on her own quarter every September since 1893, because nobody would do it for her. She was not consulted about the ordinance, and her name is not in it. The plow is in a machinery shed on that place yet. It is a 14-inch walking plow with a worn share and one handle mended with a strip of iron, and her great-grandson does not farm with it, and has been asked twice to sell it and has not. And that was the story of Marit Sohlberg, who was right in law and paid for it for 3 years in a hole in a hillside, and who watched a fire come out of the northwest for perhaps 40 seconds on the 14th of October, and then went and got the mare. If somebody once did a hard thing for people who were not speaking to them, tell me about them in the comments. If this one warmed you tonight, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I hope it found you well. I'll see you in the next one.